Yes, thank you, Lee, for that reading. Thank you, Craig, for the prayer. Craig is one of, I don't know, a handful, 2 or 3 Jewish people of Jewish background who are still of Jewish background, who are a part of the life of this church. And what I wonder is, besides those folks, how many of us here who are Christian, raised Christian or new to Christianity, have ever tried to observe a Sabbath? Few people, good. How about for like more than one? Yeah. I tried a 6-week experiment of trying to observe the Sabbath and just doing all the restrictions that a typical Jewish community would impose. So no cooking, no driving, no shopping, no work, no email, no screens, no yard work, just an entire day of rest. It involved, as it does for many Jews, working and planning all week so that space is open and available for us. Following the Jewish custom, I would start at sundown on Friday and end the Sabbath at sundown on Saturday. And I have 2 observations from that experiment, trying to do that for 6 weeks. One, it was absolutely transcendent. It was like time itself was holy. It created a peace within me that lasted for days after that experience. I felt grounded and I felt free. It was amazing. And 2, it was absolutely impossible to sustain more than 1 or 2 Saturdays. I just couldn't do it. Between demands of family, between work demands, just not being organized and motivated earlier in the week to make the space available, I just couldn't sustain it. And I learned from that experiment that I think the only way to really sustain a Sabbath practice is to have the whole community do it together, to support each other in the work, to hold each other accountable, and to guide about what is acceptable and what is not. And that is a critical piece. What is okay to do on a Sabbath and what is not? It's not easy just to make those calls alone in your own head. For instance, I actually love yard work. I love being outside and getting my hands dirty and lifting heavy things. If I sit outside in the backyard to read a book, I'm just going to get up after a few minutes and start putzing around the yard because that's just what I love to do. Do I really have to force myself on the Sabbath not to do that, to just sit? I also love cooking. A really wonderful day for me would be, a wonderful Saturday would be to walk or bike to a local farmer's market, buy some fresh food, bring it back, spend a couple hours in the kitchen preparing it. That would just be so rich and full for me as a morning. But on the Sabbath, you're not supposed to cook, you're not supposed to buy, you're not supposed to do any of those things. So can I do the thing that is life-giving to me even though it's work? Where do you draw the line? Is it about doing life-giving things or about rest? Sabbath discernment, I believe, requires community discernment. Now, it's true that we might roll our eyes at some of the things that the Jewish community then does, like Craig mentioned, unscrewing the bulb in the fridge so that light doesn't come on. Or if you've ever been to a Jewish hospital on a Saturday, you know that there's one elevator that stops at every floor and opens the doors and closes, goes up to the next floor, opens and closes, so that Orthodox Jewish people do not have to press a button and thereby complete a circuit, which is considered kindling a fire, which is prohibited on the Sabbath. Okay, we might roll our eyes at that and say, oh, that's just too much. But if we are going to try to honor this Sabbath thing, which is one of the 10 commandments, by the way, don't kill, don't commit adultery, don't steal. It's up in that category in the 10 commandments. If we're going to try to do that, then we have to answer these questions of where do we draw the line? When we read our texts like we did this morning of Luke 6, we might think that Jesus is giving some kind of definitive solution and definitive answer to these questions. But I mean, really, is he? The human one is Lord of the Sabbath? Oh, thanks. That clears everything up, Jesus. Thank you. Now I know whether I can do yard work or not. When Jesus asked, is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save life or destroy it? That might seem like, oh, well, of course it's obvious. It's lawful to do good on the Sabbath. But there is a limitless amount of good to do in this world. If that is our standard, we can work forever and never rest. There is always more good to do. A Jewish scholar that I like to listen to regularly, Dr. Amy Robertson, was commenting on this passage. She does a podcast with a Christian friend of mine. They read Old Testament texts and New Testament texts. And she was saying, this is a really interesting story, but in Judaism, this is just the beginning of the conversation. And what Jesus has said is full of holes. If this were a real Jewish community, there would be a whole 3-hour conversation that happened after Jesus finished talking here. What's clear about these texts in the Gospels, and there's 10 or 11 different Sabbath controversies or references to the Sabbath in the Gospels, is that the early church was really struggling with this question. That's what it says to me. It says that the Gospels are testimony to the struggles that the early church had about Sabbath observance. What was likely going on is that the first followers of Jesus were Jewish. Jesus was Jewish, his disciples were Jewish, and so they were observing the Sabbath in some way. But then after Jesus died and they experienced him risen on a Sunday, Sunday became the day where the followers of Jesus would come and celebrate his resurrection. And they would do that with the communion that we're about to do today. They would do that with singing and songs. It became a worship time on a Sunday morning, and we still do that today. The Jewish people were still saying, okay, do we still observe Saturday as a day of rest? And then as more new people joined the church who were not Jewish, they were saying, well, we don't need to do the Sabbath at all because we're not Jewish. And so the early church was struggling with what is the Sabbath to us as Christians? That conversation is still going on right now as we read texts like this. What does a Christian do on the Sabbath? What should that look like? We rest. Is it just about resting when we're tired? Can we do things that give us life versus not do things that pull that life out of us? In many different ways, we are still having that question, but most of us just don't do anything at all. Most Christians have very little effort towards a Sabbath practice. And I think we're poorer for it. The idea that people should have a day of rest, 1 in 7, is a profoundly innovative and progressive social practice that came out of Judaism. It's probably a very distinctive Jewish invention, Sabbath keeping. The Code of Hammurabi, which is most of what the Torah is based on. If you look at the Torah and the Code of Hammurabi, the Torah probably borrowed a whole lot from the Code of Hammurabi. There's nothing in the Code of Hammurabi about a day of rest once a week. That was a Jewish innovation. And it probably was a Jewish innovation because they were defining their community based on the Exodus story, a story of liberation. They were a liberated people, and so they were codifying liberation into their weekly observance. Compulsory Sabbath observation is also one of the first labor laws. It's a law that doesn't help the landowner. It doesn't help the rich get richer. It doesn't help the slave owner. It protects the worker. It protects the laborer. It protects the slave. You could even call it a boycott to greed. It's a practice that limits how much labor and wealth you can squeeze out of a week. Some versions of the Sabbath even call for requiring the animals to rest, so it's the first animal welfare law. Resting the land is included in some versions of the Sabbath, so it's the first environmental law. And then they took that, the Jewish people took all of that and infused it with theology, that God created the world in 6 days, and then the creator of the world, rested on the 7th day. And so we are to be like God and follow this thing that's sort of woven into who we are as people. Tricia Hersey is an author. She's known as the Nap Bishop. She wrote a book called Rest is Resistance. She's a Black woman and speaks from the Black tradition about looking back on times of slavery and stolen labor and what does rest mean in that context. She writes, treating each other and ourselves with care is not a luxury. It's an absolute necessity if we're going to thrive. Resting isn't an afterthought, it's a basic part of being human. I wish that we had the community support for Sabbath in the Christian church that exists in the Jewish community. And it may be that once a community lets go of Sabbath practice the way the American church has, that it's really hard to get it back. You get that genie back in the bottle or out of the bottle or whatever has to happen. We can't just write a bunch of Sabbath restrictions now as a church and put them in our bylaws and expect to follow them, and everybody in the church is now going to follow them because we've decided that. And that would be a very long congregational meeting, by the way. And so we're probably left, unfortunately, with each person having to discern for themselves how they're going to practice the Sabbath. And so I'll offer a couple suggestions for how an individual person might do that. But first, let me also pitch to you why I think Sabbath keeping is so urgent in these times, in the times in which we live. We need Sabbath practices today because we need practices that sustain us given everything that's happening right now in our country. You know, every day there is enough news to completely overwhelm us, to completely shut us down. Every day there is enough, story of some disgusting behavior coming out of Washington. Every day there is more threats to marginalized people and threats to our basic sense of stability. Every day there's threats to democracy and to who we are as a nation, causing us to question who we are. If we don't have practices that sustain us through all of that, we will be lost. Now you might think, no, but that's exactly it. There's too much to do for us to rest. We've got to work. But in fact, there's too much for us to do not to rest. One thing Sabbath observance does is it requires us to practice our faith in God, our faith that God is God and we are not, and that if we stop working for a day, the world will not come to an end. So I'll offer these just a few guidelines for things you might think about as you consider practicing Sabbath, assuming that you're not going to be able to do 24 hours of total rest. First, even though we might not be able to get the whole church on board with whatever we're going to do, Sabbath is meant to be practiced with others. It is meant to be done in community. So maybe it's an agreed upon prohibition or abstention or restriction within your family, within your marriage, within a friendship or a small group, or at least with an accountability partner. But it's stronger with others. And if you can't find any of that, then it can be between you and God, of course. But if you can find a partner, if you can find a friend, a small group, somebody to help where you can agree on what you were going to do together or what you're not going to do together. 2, Sabbath practice, whatever you might be abstaining from, is about scheduling it. It's not just about resting when we're tired. It's not just about stopping when we feel like it. It's stopping because we've placed a discipline in our lives that protects that time for some different kind of way of being. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel calls Sabbath a palace in time. So think about that when you're looking at your calendar, your weekly calendar. Where is my palace in time that is set aside for a different way of being? 3, be specific about what is not allowed. Channel your inner Pharisee. Get specific. Is it no phones or is it no screens whatsoever? Is it no work at all or just no work that you're paid for? Is it no news or just no cable news? One metric is to ask, is this thing that I'm doing life-giving or life-draining? What kinds of things do I do that lull me into unconsciousness? And what kinds of things do I do that awaken me into consciousness? What kinds of things cause anxiety? And what kinds of things bring true peace? Be specific about drawing those lines. Excuse me, oh my God. Sorry. I wrote better, but sometimes there's a little bit of congestion still down there. And 4, remember that Sabbath is intended as a method for resisting greed. It is a way to resist the taskmasters of this world who demand our productivity. It is a way to resist the injustices of this world. So does an activity that you're considering doing or not doing, does it support the global economy? And if it does, refrain from doing that thing. Sabbath is an act of resistance in our unjust world. In fact, let me close by expanding more on that point. I said a moment ago that Sabbath practices are urgent because we need these practices to sustain us in these times. The other reason that Sabbath observance is so urgent is because our current activity level in this world, in this culture, is part of the problem. Through our addiction to activity, we are burning up the planet's resources. We're polluting the air, the water, and the ground. We're extincting species. We're funneling money up and up and up toward the top. Sabbath practices are about reducing our consumption. It's not about treating ourselves. It's not about a day at the spa or a vacation on the beach or going out to a nice dinner. That's not Sabbath. Sabbath is about refraining from work and activity and refraining from causing others to work and be active as well. It's removing ourselves from the economy. Again, Tricia Hershey says this: we are socialized into systems that cause us to conform and to believe that our worth is connected to how much we produce. Our constant labor becomes a prison that allows us to be disembodied. Our constant labor becomes a prison that allows us to be disembodied. We become easy for the system to manipulate, disconnected from our power as divine beings, and hopeless. We forget how to dream, and this is how grind culture continues. We internalize the lies, and in turn become agents of an unsustainable way of living. It's true that rest helps us do the work of resisting the evils that are at work in the world today. But even more fundamentally, rest is the resistance. Amen.